The galaxy was vast, filled with countless races, some peaceful, some ready for battle. After centuries of tension and small-scale conflicts, the peaceful races of the galaxy decided it was time for change. They needed to unite before the constant struggles took everything they had worked so hard to build. And so, they called for an alliance that would bring peace, trade, and prosperity to all. Leaders from various planets gathered in a grand meeting hall, a space station floating in the heart of the galaxy. Representatives from the Elathians, a species known for their intelligence and diplomacy, the Orcs, a race of skilled engineers, and the peaceful Orcs, with their unmatched ability to heal, all took their places. They sat in a massive circle, each one hoping for a new beginning. The station buzzed with quiet conversations as each representative exchanged hopeful glances. The idea of an alliance felt like the answer to all their troubles. No more wars, no more fear. Peace was within their reach, if only they could agree on the terms. At the center of the circle, a tall Urkin named Emera rose. She was known for her calm nature and healing abilities, a perfect leader for peace. Her voice was steady, yet filled with hope as she spoke to the assembly. "We have faced much hardship," Emera began, "but together we can achieve something greater. Our alliance will ensure that future generations will live without fear of war, without fear of loss." Her words were met with nods of agreement from the others. But not everyone was convinced. The Elathian leader, a sharp-eyed man named Kadar, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His people were wary of forming a bond with those they didn't fully trust. Their history was built on cautious negotiation, and the idea of fully trusting others to uphold peace was not an easy one. "We must remember," Kadar spoke, his voice low but firm, "trust must be earned. Words alone will not secure peace. We need to ensure that our alliance will protect us, not leave us vulnerable." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. The peaceful races all wanted to protect their way of life, but it was clear they would need something more than just promises. A true bond would require proof, something they could all rely on. Before the discussion could continue, a sudden beep echoed through the room, breaking the calm atmosphere. An urgent message blinked on the central display screen. It was a distress signal, sent from a distant region of the galaxy, beyond the territories of the peaceful races. The message was simple yet chilling. "Help! War incarnate. It cannot be stopped. You cannot negotiate with war. It will consume you all." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the screen. The peaceful leaders exchanged worried glances. For the first time, the idea of a peaceful future felt uncertain. Who was this war incarnate, and why did they think the peaceful races could not be saved? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the peaceful races of the galaxy realized they might soon face a challenge unlike any they had ever known. And in that moment, they understood something important. Peace was no longer just a dream. It was a fight they would have to endure. The room was filled with an eerie silence after the distress signal had been broadcast across the peaceful meeting hall. All the leaders were staring at the screen, their faces filled with confusion and fear. The words on the screen seemed to echo in their minds. "War incarnate. It cannot be stopped. You cannot negotiate with war. It will consume you all." Emera, the Irakan leader, stood frozen for a moment. Her thoughts were racing. Was this some kind of trick? Or was there truly an unstoppable force out there that threatened everything they had worked for? "We need to investigate this," Kadar, the Elathian leader, said in a harsh whisper. "We can't afford to ignore it." There was a brief pause as the room erupted into whispers. Some were scared, others were skeptical, but they all agreed that they could not simply sit back and let this mysterious warning go unanswered. They needed answers, fast. Emera took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We cannot make any rash decisions," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We must send a team to explore the source of this signal. We cannot risk it being true, but we cannot ignore it either." After some debate, a plan was quickly formed. A small group of the Alliance's best ships would head to the coordinates of the distress signal. The peacekeepers, warriors, and diplomats would work together, hoping to uncover the truth of the warning. Emira knew the dangers of sending a mixed team, but there was no other choice. It was the only way to ensure they could protect the Alliance. As the leaders discussed the details of the mission, a sense of unease spread through the room. The peaceful races had never faced an enemy like this before. Sure, they had dealt with pirates, rogue factions, and even skirmishes in the past, but nothing compared to the mysterious force that now loomed over them. The decision was made. The team would leave immediately. The Alliance's ship, Unity's Hope, would lead the journey. Emira, Kedar, and a small group of trusted advisors boarded the ship. They knew this was a critical mission, and time was running out. As the ship departed, the peaceful leaders watched it fade into the distance. Their eyes were filled with uncertainty. They knew they were about to face something that might be far worse than any of them had imagined. Hours passed as Unity's Hope traveled deeper into unknown space. The stars seemed to flicker as the ship entered a region no one from the peaceful races had ever visited. The tension among the crew grew with each passing moment. They were on the edge of something dangerous, something they couldn't predict. Then, the communications officer on board made a startling discovery. A new message had come through. It was another distress signal, even more urgent than the first. It was from an unknown source, but this time, the message was different. It was clearer, more detailed. I repeat, the war incarnate has arrived. It is not a force, not a being, but an unstoppable power. Do not approach. You cannot survive this. The crew's fear intensified as they realized they were on the verge of meeting something that might change everything. A power like no other. A power that could shatter the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. The ship moved forward, drawn to the unknown, as the peaceful races prepared themselves for the fight of their lives. The crew of Unity's Hope anxiously watched the stars as they entered the uncharted space. Their mission was becoming more dangerous with each passing second. No one knew what awaited them at the source of the distress signal, but they were committed to finding answers. Emira stood by the window of the ship's command center, her eyes scanning the endless dark. The silence around her was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ship's engines. She could feel the weight of the situation on her shoulders. If this war incarnate was real, they would need more than peace talks to survive. They would need strength, something the peaceful races had never truly known. We're almost there. Kedar's voice broke through her thoughts. His sharp eyes were locked on the control panel, tracking their course toward the unknown. Let's prepare, Emira replied quietly, turning to face the others. We don't know what we'll find. Stay alert. The crew nodded, their faces serious. As the ship approached the coordinates, the atmosphere in the command center grew tense. Everyone knew that they were venturing into dangerous territory, but no one expected what would happen next. Without warning, the ship's sensors went wild. Lights blinked, alarms went off, and the ship's systems struggled to process what they were seeing. The stars ahead began to distort, rippling as if reality itself was bending. The crew froze, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. What is that? One of the officers muttered, his voice shaking. Emira's heart raced as she watched the screen. A massive object appeared out of the distortion, something unlike anything she had ever seen. It was enormous, larger than any ship the peaceful races had ever built. A warship, but not just any warship. This one radiated power. It seemed to pulse with energy, its hull marked with strange symbols that glowed with a dark intensity. The ship had no visible crew, no markings to identify it. It looked like it had been designed purely for war. Emira felt an icy chill run down her spine. We need to communicate, Kedar said, his voice steady despite the growing panic around him. Hail them. The officer quickly sent a communication signal to the strange ship, but the response was not what they expected. The screen flickered, and a single figure appeared. A man, human, but not just any man. His face was stern, hardened by countless battles, his eyes filled with the kind of intensity that made even the most experienced warriors uneasy. "I am Captain Alden," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "I represent the war incarnate." The crew stared in shock, struggling to process the sudden appearance of the human. It was clear from his demeanor that this man was no ordinary soldier. He was a force of nature, someone who had seen and survived horrors that the peaceful races could hardly imagine. Emira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the confusion in her mind. "What do you mean, war incarnate?" she asked. "Who are you, and why have you come?" Captain Alden's eyes flickered with a cold, almost unreadable expression. "You should have listened to the warning," he said. "The war you fear is already here. I came to prepare you, for the galaxy does not negotiate with war. It dominates." The room went silent. The weight of his words hung in the air, and the peaceful leaders understood. This was not a simple force. This was a man who embodied the harsh reality of war, and they would have to face him, whether they were ready or not. Captain Alden's words echoed in the room long after the screen had gone dark. The galaxy does not negotiate with war. It dominates. Emira couldn't shake the feeling that they had just encountered something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The crew of Unity's Hope remained silent, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. It was clear that Captain Alden wasn't here to make deals or help them. He was here because war was already in motion, and he believed that nothing short of domination would stop it. "We need to take action," Kedar said, breaking the silence. "We can't let this man, or whatever he is, control the galaxy. We need to fight back before it's too late." Emira nodded but felt a heavy weight in her chest. She had hoped that the peaceful races could find a way to solve their problems without violence. But now, faced with the looming presence of a force that believed in domination, she wasn't so sure anymore. "We need to understand him first," Emira replied softly. "This human, Alden, is not like the threats we've faced before. We need to learn more about him before making any rash decisions." The crew continued to discuss their options, but deep down, everyone knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. Alden's presence was a challenge to everything the peaceful races had ever believed in. His cold confidence and the power of his ship made it clear they weren't in control of this situation anymore. As Unity's Hope continued on its course, the peaceful races began to realize that they had no choice but to face war on their own terms. But how could they, a collection of races that valued peace and diplomacy, stand against someone like Alden? They had no answers, only questions, and that made them uneasy. Later, the ship's sensors began to pick up strange activity. Ships of unknown origin, unlike any they had ever seen, began to appear on the edges of the star system. The peaceful races had been expecting to find some form of alien force, but these ships were different. They were huge, black, and sleek, with an intimidating presence. "They're closing in on us," the communications officer said urgently. "We don't know who they are, but they're not responding to our hails." Emira felt her heart race. It was happening. The war was here, and they were caught in the middle of it. There was no turning back now. "Captain Alden must have called for reinforcements," Kedar said, his face grim. "These ships are part of the war incarnate. We have no idea how powerful they are, but they've already surrounded us." Panic began to spread throughout the crew. The peaceful races had always been good at talking their way out of situations, at negotiating and finding peaceful solutions. But now, they were face to face with something that didn't care about words. It only cared about dominance. Emira knew they had to make a decision, and fast. "Prepare for battle," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We will not go down without a fight." For the first time since the alliance had formed, the peaceful races were about to face war, not just as individuals, but as a united front. Emira hoped they were ready for the storm that was coming. As the ships drew closer, a sense of inevitability settled over the crew. War had arrived at their doorstep, and they were no longer in control. They had to fight, not just for survival, but for the very future of the galaxy. The moment Emera gave the order, chaos erupted on Unity's hope. The peaceful races had never fought a battle like this before. They had trained for it, prepared for it in theory, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of war. Their ships, once symbols of peace and unity, now had to serve as weapons of defense. The unknown ships surrounding them didn't wait. Without warning, they launched a barrage of weapons, energy blasts that tore through space like lightning. The peaceful Alliance's fleet had no choice but to react quickly. "Shields up," Kadar shouted, his voice filled with urgency. The crew scrambled to power the defenses, and a shimmering shield flickered into place just in time to block the incoming blast. But even with the shields activated, the force of the attack rattled the ship. Emera's heart raced. She had never imagined they would face something like this. The peaceful races had no experience in large-scale combat, but now they were thrown into the heart of battle, and there was no turning back. "Return fire," Emera commanded, her voice steady despite the growing panic. She had been trained for diplomacy, not for war, but in that moment, she knew she had to lead her people through this storm. The peaceful fleet fired their weapons, but they were no match for the advanced firepower of the enemy ships. The blasts came too fast, too powerful, and soon the peaceful ships began to falter. One ship, the Starward, was struck in the side, sending a massive explosion across the blackness of space. The crew gasped in horror as they watched the ship spiral out of control. Emera's stomach turned. The loss of even one ship felt like a personal failure, but there was no time to mourn. The battle raged on. Captain Alden's words came back to her, echoing in her mind. War does not negotiate, it dominates. The peaceful races had been naive. They had hoped to find a way to talk their way out of this, but it was clear now that they were dealing with an enemy who didn't care about peace. In the chaos, Emera's eyes caught a glimpse of a sleek, black warship at the heart of the enemy fleet. It was unlike anything she had seen before. Faster, deadlier. It looked as though it was built to destroy. Emera's pulse quickened. She realized that this wasn't just any enemy. This was the war incarnate. It was the living embodiment of Alden's warning. "Target that ship," Kadar ordered, pointing at the menacing vessel. The peaceful fleet focused their firepower on the enemy flagship, but it was too fast, evading their blasts with ease. The warship darted through the stars like a shadow, leaving destruction in its wake. As the enemy forces continued to attack, Emera felt her resolve harden. She knew they had to push forward, no matter the cost. If they gave up now, everything they had built, the peace, the alliance, the hope for a better future, would be lost. The peaceful races were not warriors, but they were determined. They fought with everything they had. Every blast, every strike, was a reminder of what they stood to lose. And despite their lack of experience, they fought with the courage of those who had no choice but to survive. The first clash had begun, and there was no going back. The battle had been raging for hours. The peaceful fleet was badly outmatched by the enemy's strength, and yet they refused to give up. The Unity's hope was damaged, but still functioning. Its crew, once focused only on diplomacy, now found themselves in the midst of something they never imagined: war. Emera paced the command center, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore the harsh reality they were facing. Their peace had been shattered in an instant. Alden's words haunted her. The galaxy does not negotiate with war. It dominates. He had warned them. And now they were living that truth. The peaceful races had always relied on their intelligence, their creativity, and their ability to form alliances. But now, it seemed those qualities weren't enough. Alden's forces were unstoppable. The technology they wielded, the sheer power of their ships, was far beyond what the peaceful races could handle. "How long until the enemy fleet reaches our core planets?" Emera asked, turning to Kadar, who was monitoring the battle from his station. "Less than 12 hours, Kedar replied, his voice grim. "If we don't find a way to turn the tide, they will reach our home systems. We won't survive." Amara felt her heart sink. They couldn't win this battle with what they had. They needed something more, something they hadn't considered before. War was not a part of their nature, but now they were forced to act like warriors if they wanted to survive. "There must be another way," Amira said, more to herself than anyone else. "We can't lose everything we've worked for." But as she looked around at her crew, she knew that the time for negotiation was long past. They were up against something too powerful for words. It was a test of survival, and the peaceful races had to fight to protect their future. Suddenly, a new message flashed on the screen. It was from the mysterious human Captain Alden. "I've given you a chance to prepare." His voice came through, cold and emotionless. "You had your piece. Now face the consequences. War is the only way forward. Accept it or be destroyed." Amara's fists clenched. She hated how calm he sounded, as if he had already accepted that this would be the end of the peaceful races. She refused to believe that. There had to be a way to fight back. There had to be a way to show Alden and his forces that they wouldn't go down without a fight. As the message ended, Kedar turned to Amira, his eyes filled with determination. "We have no choice now. We need to fight back with everything we have." Amira took a deep breath, her mind made up. "Prepare the fleet for one final push," she ordered. "We're not going to let them destroy us. We'll show them that peace does not mean weakness. We fight for our home. We fight for our future." The crew moved quickly, preparing the fleet for the next phase of the battle. The peaceful races had never been warriors, but now they had no choice. They would fight to protect what they held dear. They would show Alden that war could not be the only answer. It was time for them to awaken. As the fleet gathered, Amira stood tall. She knew the odds were against them, but she also knew one thing for certain. They were ready to face whatever came next. The peaceful races would not give up. Not now. Not ever. The peaceful fleet had regrouped, their ships now lined up in a defensive formation. Their weapons were ready, and every crew member knew this would be their final stand. The enemy fleet was massive, but the peaceful races had something they hadn't had before: determination. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for the future of their galaxy. Amira stood at the front of the command center, her eyes fixed on the view screen. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons charging up. The calm, eerie silence from earlier had been replaced with the sound of rushing energy, signaling the start of another battle. "Shields up," Kedar called, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We can't let them break through." The crew worked quickly, activating their ship shields and preparing the weapons for launch. It was clear now that the peaceful races had underestimated the enemy's strength. But the time for hesitation was over. It was fight or perish. Suddenly, the communications officer's voice broke through the tension. "There's something else. We're picking up unknown ships on the edge of our sensor range. They're moving fast. We can't identify them." Amira's heart skipped a beat. Another threat. She had hoped that the enemy's fleet was all they had to worry about. But now something else was closing in on them. Whatever these unknown ships were, they were coming fast, and they were about to make the situation even worse. "Can we get a better reading on them?" Amira asked, her voice calm but filled with urgency. The officer worked quickly, his fingers flying across the console. "It's not clear, but they're approaching rapidly. They're too fast to be a part of the enemy fleet." Amira's stomach tightened. They had barely managed to hold off the first wave, and now this new threat had emerged. Were they about to face another surprise from the war Incarnate? Or was this an even greater danger? "We need to prepare for any scenario," Kedar said, his voice firm. "Get the fleet into defensive position. Ready the weapons." But before they could react, the unknown ships appeared out of the shadows of space, darting into view. They were sleek, fast-moving, and unlike anything the peaceful races had ever encountered. There were dozens of them, each moving independently but coordinated. Their shape was unlike any known ship design, shifting and changing in appearance as if made of living metal. They were fast, weaving through space with incredible precision. "Who are they?" Emira whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "They're not with the enemy," Kedar said. "These ships, they're something else. But I don't know who or what they are." The peaceful fleet's weapons targeted the incoming ships, but the unknown vessels were too quick. They dodged the incoming fire with ease, their movements almost impossible to follow. The peaceful races had never faced anything like this before. They had been fighting for survival against Alden's forces, but now they had to deal with a completely new enemy. Suddenly, a ship in the unknown fleet opened fire, sending blasts of energy toward one of the peaceful vessels. The blast hit the ship's shields, shaking it violently. The crew inside scrambled to keep the ship from losing control. The unknown ships were not here to negotiate. They were here to fight. "Return fire," Emira shouted, her voice filled with determination. "Defend the fleet." But as the battle raged on, Emira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into a much larger conflict, one that they hadn't seen coming. The enemy had never been their only concern. Now there was something far more dangerous lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. The peaceful races were fighting to survive, but now they faced a deeper, more complex threat than they could have ever imagined. The galaxy was on the brink of destruction. The peaceful races had been forced into war, their ships fighting fiercely against the forces of Alden and the mysterious new threat that had arrived without warning. The enemy was everywhere, more advanced, more aggressive, and the peaceful races were struggling to hold their ground. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. The peaceful races, once divided by their differences, began to work together like never before. They had no choice. Their very survival depended on it. Emira stood at the command center of Unity's hope, watching the battle unfold on the screens. Ships from the peaceful fleet moved in tight formations, their weapons firing in synchronized patterns. It was a sign of cooperation, something they had never seen before. The peaceful races, once hesitant to rely on each other, had come together to fight a common enemy. "We're holding them off," Kedar said, his voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. "But not for long. We need more firepower, or they'll break through our defenses." Emira nodded. They had already lost several ships, and the enemy fleet was relentless. She knew they had to do something drastic, something bold, if they were going to survive. "We can't wait for reinforcements," Emira said. "We need to push them back now. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for our future." The crew nodded in agreement. They had seen their homes destroyed, their people endangered, and now they knew that fighting back was their only option. "Target the enemy flagship," Emira commanded. "If we take down their leader, the rest of their fleet will fall apart." The peaceful fleet adjusted their weapons, locking onto the enemy flagship, the massive warship that had been leading the attack. It was heavily shielded, but with all their ships working together, they might stand a chance. As the fleet fired their weapons, the enemy flagship returned fire, sending waves of energy blasts in all directions. The peaceful fleet dodged and returned fire, the air crackling with the intensity of battle. The enemy flagship seemed to be absorbing the hits, but its shields were beginning to falter. "This is it," Kedar said, watching the enemy ship struggle to hold up under their combined fire. "We can break through." But just as they thought they had the upper hand, a new surprise appeared. From the dark depths of space, a massive wave of energy surged toward them, an overwhelming force that pushed the peaceful fleet back. The peaceful race's ships struggled to stay in formation as the energy wave knocked them off course. Their shields flickered, and several ships lost power. Emira's heart sank. They had underestimated the power of the war Incarnate, but even as their ships faltered, Emira knew they couldn't give up now. If they did, Everything they had fought for would be lost. "Push forward," she shouted. "We can't let them break us." With renewed determination, the peaceful fleet regrouped and made a final push. They aimed everything at the enemy flagship, their weapons unleashing one last, concentrated blast. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The blast hit the enemy flagship directly, shattering its shields and piercing through its hull. The flagship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, the shockwave rippling through space. The enemy fleet faltered. Without their leader, they were disorganized, and the peaceful races took full advantage of the moment. One by one, the enemy ships began to retreat. Victory was within reach. Amara watched in disbelief as the last of the enemy ships turned and fled. The peaceful races had won. Against all odds, they had stood together and fought for their survival. But even as the enemy ships disappeared into the darkness, Amara knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy had changed. The peaceful races had learned the value of unity, and they had shown the universe that they would never back down from a fight. They were no longer just peaceful races. They were warriors, and they would defend their future, no matter the cost. The peaceful races had won their first major victory. The enemy fleet was retreating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the galaxy was quiet. But Emira knew better than to believe the fight was over. Their victory had been hard-earned, but it was only one battle. The war Incarnate and the forces behind it were still out there, and they would be back. Amira stood on the bridge of Unity's hope, staring at the dark expanse of space before her. Her mind was filled with the memory of the explosion, the enemy flagship breaking apart as their weapons finally found their mark. She could still hear the distant sounds of the battle, the deafening explosions, the cries of victory, and the quiet aftermath. She had hoped this would be the end of the war, but she knew that peace was never so simple. The war Incarnate wasn't just a man, as she had originally believed. It was a force, a philosophy, a way of life, and there were many more who believed in it. "We can't stop here," Kedar said, stepping up beside her. "The enemy is weakened, but they'll come back stronger. They always do." Emira nodded slowly. The peaceful races had learned it the hard way. They had hoped for a peaceful galaxy, but they were now forced to accept the truth. The galaxy was full of forces that didn't care for peace. They cared for power. They cared for domination. "We need to prepare for what's next," Emira said, her voice firm. "But we also need to heal. The galaxy has been torn apart, and it will take time to rebuild. We can't fight forever. We need to find a way to coexist with those who don't want war." "Is that even possible?" Kedar asked, looking out into the stars. "Can we really rebuild and trust each other when war is always lurking in the shadows?" Amira didn't have an answer. The peace they had fought for was fragile, and she wasn't sure how long it would last. But one thing was clear. They couldn't afford to lose hope. They had seen the strength of their unity, and that unity was their best chance for a lasting peace. "Perhaps it's time we look to the future," Emira said quietly. "We've learned that war will always be a part of the galaxy, but so will peace. If we're to survive, we need to find a balance. We need to be ready for whatever comes next, but we also need to build something new." As the peaceful races continued to recover from the battle, the galaxy began to shift. The once divided species had started to find common ground. Their shared experience of war had brought them closer, and now they were united in a way they hadn't been before. There were still challenges ahead, but Emira believed that they could face them together. The galaxy was not just a place of war, but also of hope, and as long as they remembered that, they could survive anything. The peaceful races had found their strength, not in weapons, but in unity. They had faced war Incarnate, and they had proven that, even in the darkest of times, they could rise above it. The future was uncertain, but as long as they stood together, Emira knew they could overcome any obstacle. They had come through the storm. Now, It was time to rebuild. The aftermath of the battle felt strange. The peaceful races had won, but the victory was bittersweet. There was no grand celebration. The galaxy was still scared, and the war was far from over. Yet, as Amira stood on the bridge of Unity's hope, watching the stars slowly pass by, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within her. They had been tested, pushed to their limits, but they had come out on the other side stronger. The peaceful races had faced the war incarnate, a force that seemed unstoppable, and they had fought with everything they had. They had won, but they had learned something more important in the process. The galaxy was not just a place of peace, but also a place of conflict. They could no longer ignore that reality. The peaceful races had always believed in diplomacy and unity, but they had learned that sometimes survival meant being ready for war. "We did it," Kadar said quietly, standing beside Amira. "We pushed them back. But now what?" Amira turned to him, her face thoughtful. "Now, we rebuild. We learn from this. We build a future where war doesn't define us, but where we're ready for it if it ever comes again." The fleet had been damaged, but they had resources. The peaceful races had the technology to repair their ships, rebuild their homes, and heal the wounds that war had left behind. But more than that, they had something they hadn't had before, a bond, a unity forged in the fires of battle. Amira looked out into the vastness of space, thinking about all that had happened. The war incarnate had tried to destroy them, but in the process, it had brought the peaceful races together. They were no longer just a collection of separate planets and species. They were a united force, stronger than any enemy they had faced. "We've learned something important," Amira said, turning back to Kadar. "We've learned that peace isn't just a dream. It's something we must work for, something we must protect. But we also have to be strong. The galaxy is full of danger, and we can't pretend it's not there." Kadar nodded, his face serious. "We've seen what happens when we don't prepare. We won't make that mistake again." The peaceful races now understood that peace required more than just avoiding conflict. It required strength, determination, and unity. They could no longer be passive. They had to be active participants in the galaxy's future. Amira's heart swelled with pride. She had led her people through the darkest of times, and now she could see a new dawn breaking. It wasn't the kind of peace they had imagined, but it was a peace born of resilience, strength, and the willingness to stand together. As the peaceful fleet continued its journey, they knew there was still much work to be done. The war incarnate was not gone, and new threats would rise. But for the first time, the peaceful races felt ready. They were no longer just survivors. They were a force to be reckoned with. The galaxy was vast, filled with endless possibilities, and the peaceful races, united in purpose, were ready to face whatever came next.